A story we decided not to cover last month was the Russian troop buildup at the Ukrainian border, because as regular viewers of the channel might know, Russia had already done that shit twice, last year alone. Due to the ever-changing nature of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we purposely finalized the script as late as possible. However, with this fast timeline and a bombard of propaganda to sift through, there's still a lot we don't know. To give context for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we'll have to wind the clock back almost 8 years exactly. In February 2014, protests against the pro-Russian president of Ukraine would eventually lead to a revolution, which would spring an entirely new government within the country. As Russia didn't recognize this new government and considered the volatile country as being a threat to Russians within the nation, Vladimir Putin invaded the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as yoinking the Crimean Peninsula. Ever since, these regions have been under the control of Russian-backed mercenaries, which although gave them a thinly veiled cover of deniability, really wasn't fooling anyone. The majority of what Russia does is absolute bullshit. However, Vladimir Putin's claim over the Crimean Peninsula can at least be put into a grey area. Although not recognized internationally as Russian territory, the majority of the Crimean population consider themselves Russian and speak the Russian language, which certainly can't be said for the rest of Ukraine. Since 2014, over 10,000 people have died in skirmishes between Ukraine and these Russian-backed separatists. On the other hand, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions had held referendums, which officially saw citizens overwhelmingly vote in favor of becoming part of Russia, but the process itself was about as dodgy as your local NFT dealer. The referendum had exactly no international observers, no up-to-date electoral lists, the ballot papers were photocopies, and the entire process was overseen by very scary Russian men, armed with very scary automatic weapons. In fact, a person fucking died in one town, which tells you just how legitimate the process must have been. Since 2014, Ukraine has become much more aligned with the rest of Europe and other democratically minded states. This has been seen as a threat to Russia, as Ukraine houses the biggest population of Russians outside of the motherland, and should Ukraine officially become a member of NATO, this would destroy any hope of getting the Soviet Union band back together. On the 20th of February, the Russian parliament voted to recognize the independent states of Donetsk and Luhansk. 2 days later, Vladimir Putin ordered Russian troops into these regions, which it now recognizes as part of Russia, but they had no intention of stopping at these borders. Although it's quite clear that the purpose of the invasion is to take over the nation of Ukraine and either absorb it into Russia or install a pro-Russian puppet into power, the justification for the invasion is an entire topic in and of itself. Before the invasion, Russian separatists shelled the town of Stanitsa Luhanska, wounding 2 teachers and cutting off power to half the town. According to Russian state-controlled media, this attack was orchestrated by Ukrainian forces. However, nearly every other intelligence service with 2 brain cells to rub together called this claim bullshit almost immediately. The attack is known as a false flag operation, where one group stages an attack disguised as another group, often to justify an escalation of their choosing. As we're all gamers here, viewers might remember the No Russian mission in Modern Warfare 2, where Russian extremists shoot up the Moscow airport in order to justify a war with the United States. The title of the mission, No Russian, is a reference to the attack being a false flag operation. Although not nearly as extreme, Vladimir Putin sure as shit tries to sell it that way, even going as far as falsely accusing Ukraine of a genocide in the east of the country and handing out around 700,000 Russian passports so their actions could be justified as protecting Russian citizens. Mr. Putin also went as far as accusing Ukrainian society of having become pro-Nazi. However, this claim quickly falls apart under even the slightest bit of scrutiny. From what we could find, rates of neo-Nazi behavior in Ukraine and Russia are quite similar, and even though there is indeed a group within Ukraine with around 10,000 members, this doesn't exactly reflect the nation's 44 million people. In fact, Ukraine is the only country outside of Israel with both a Jewish head of state and a Jewish head of government, with President Zelensky's grandfather actually serving in the Soviet army to fight against Nazis and losing 3 family members to the Holocaust. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin could have just accused President Zelensky of shitting in his cornflakes and saved us all the trouble of listening to his bullshit excuses to invade. The invasion itself started on the 24th of February, with Russian forces attacking from occupied Crimea in the south, the Donbas region in the east, and the Russian puppet state of Belarus from the north, which viewers might recognize as being run by Harry Potter's uncle, who rigged the nation's elections after he was about to lose to a YouTuber. This truly is a strange time to be alive. Almost immediately, Russia struck as many key military installations as they could, including weapons depots, airfields, and command centers. President Zelensky would then declare martial law and immediately sever diplomatic relations with Russia. Fighting would break out all across the country, with at least 100,000 civilians already having evacuated, many being accepted as refugees, into Moldova and Romania. During the opening day of the invasion, thousands of war stories were written for the ages, but perhaps the most famous was the invasion of Snake Island, a tiny piece of land just 35 kilometers from mainland Ukraine. At around 6 in the evening, Ukrainian border guards posted on the island were approached by 2 Russian Navy ships and ordered to surrender. The official response to the request was, quote, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself," which might just be the most acute case of big dick energy recorded in the last decade. The Russian warships would ultimately open fire, wiping out all 13 of the island's occupants, who would then all be posthumously awarded with the title of Hero of Ukraine, the highest military honor in the country. Russian defense media would later claim that the island was occupied by 82 Ukrainian soldiers, who all surrendered voluntarily. By the end of the first day, 137 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians were declared dead. President Zelensky ordered a general mobilization for all males aged 18 to 60, and Russian forces had taken control over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant for old time's sake. On day 2, Russian forces had entered the district of Obolon, in the nation's capital of Kiev, less than 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian parliament. By this time, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense announced that all citizens, regardless of age, were eligible to volunteer for military service. President Zelensky asked residents of the capital to prepare Molotov cocktails for the imminent arrival of Russian troops, as well as hand out 18,000 guns to residents who wanted to fight. By this time, it was expected that Russia would already have air superiority over Ukrainian airspace. However, it appeared Ukraine's air defenses were intact, if not degraded. US intelligence announced that Russian troops had not advanced as quickly as either they or Vladimir Putin would have expected. However, warned that Russia had only used around 30% of its overall massed troops for the invasion. By day 3, a Ukrainian fighter jet shot down a Russian transport plane south of Kiev, ending another day where Russia had unexpectedly failed to gain air superiority. Russian forces successfully took the southern port city of Berdyansk. However, its northern invasion force was less successful, suffering logistical issues, which stalled the advance of tanks and other armored vehicles. Meanwhile, despite offers from the United States to have him evacuated, President Zelensky stated, quote, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." US Secretary of State Antony Blinken would make an announcement the same day, declaring that $350 million in weapons, ammunition, and various military equipment had been authorized to be sent to Ukrainian forces. The international response to the invasion has been overwhelmingly negative, and excluding a few authoritarian states such as Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Syria, there wasn't much love for Russia. China on the other hand seemed to be mostly indifferent to the invasion, while the Taliban called for peace between the two sides. At the same time, NATO-aligned countries were busy charging up a collective spirit bomb of coordinated sanctions. The European Union declared it would be imposing the harshest package of sanctions it had ever put into practice, while the United States piled on with its own targeted sanctions to both banks, as well as powerful Russian billionaires close to President Putin. The United States also instituted export controls, which would restrict Russian access to high-tech hardware and software, of which any part was developed within the United States. Not only does this make it extremely hard to fix security vulnerabilities, but eventually it will make it near impossible to replace military hardware, forcing Russia to rely on its current stockpile. The United Kingdom also joined in on the sanctions, excluding Russian banks from the UK financial system, and freezing the assets of around 100 key individuals and entities. Other nations such as Australia, Japan, and Canada have all enacted various degrees of sanctions, while Germany has halted certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a huge piece of infrastructure designed to transport Russian gas to heat an estimated 26 million German homes. On the 27th of February, Ukrainian allies decided to block Russia's access to the global financial system by banning Russian banks from accessing the SWIFT payment infrastructure. What this essentially means is although Russia will still be able to make transactions, it makes it much more complicated and expensive to do so, making it severely difficult to import or export anything within the country. This, combined with the Russian ruble hitting an all-time low shortly after the invasion, certainly doesn't place the country in a comfortable position. The reason as to why exactly Vladimir Putin would decide to invade has been a matter of debate, but according to Mark Galeotti, an expert on Russian security affairs, it might be as simple as a matter of pride. Mr. Galeotti said, quote, "It's not about Russia. It's about Putin and this small circle of people around him who dominate this country. This is a view of a bunch of old men who can't quite get over the fact that they are no longer running a superpower." In many ways, there might be truth to this statement. Russia's influence on the world stage has significantly shrunk since the fall of the Soviet Union over 30 years ago. The empire was broken into 15 separate states, and Western influence has reached the doorsteps of even Russia's closest neighbors. Russia's economic situation is also laughable when compared to similar-sized nations, with the US states of California, Texas, and New York, all individually having larger economies than the entirety of Russia. At this stage, I think it's appropriate to compare Putin to the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Unlike most world leaders, Mr. Zelensky didn't start a career in politics. Rather, he finished his law degree before starting a career in comedy. Fast forward to 2015, and Zelensky would star in the television series Servant of the People, where he played a high school history teacher who would go on to become the president of Ukraine after his anti-corruption classroom rant went viral. The production company then decided to create a political party named after the show, and after just a 4-month political campaign in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky would become the president of Ukraine with a staggering 73% of the vote. By the time Russia invaded, Zelensky's refusal to leave the capital effectively ended Vladimir Putin's reputation overnight, as no amount of photo ops of the Russian leader fishing, riding on horseback, or attending judo tournaments could possibly be as Chad-like as standing steadfast in the face of a much larger invading force. If the invasion of Ukraine really was a project to prop up Putin's legacy, it seems Volodymyr Zelensky is about to become everything Putin's carefully curated propaganda wishes he could be. Support for the invasion within Russia is difficult to properly determine, as although there were protests in 51 cities across the country, the nation's tightly controlled media isn't exactly a good representation of the general attitude of the Russian people. What we can do, however, is see exactly what kind of coverage the invasion is getting in Russian media, as the Russian state-controlled news network, RT, is available on YouTube for anyone to watch and enjoy. It took us around 10 seconds to find a video which is entirely propaganda and is complete with a comment section filled with Russian bots to spread support for the invasion. We'd like to make the point that so far 100% of our news coverage this year has been age restricted, which doesn't appear to be a problem for a channel openly supporting Vladimir Putin's invasion. It's very likely that events have continued to unfold in dramatic and unexpected ways in the short space between writing and editing this portion of the video. However, we expect this will become a regular segment for the series long into the foreseeable future. Before we get into full troop movements for the Ukrainian invasion, we should probably start by fixing our fuck up from last month. In our last video, we reported on the Snake Island standoff, which was made famous by the Ukrainian border guards, who told a Russian warship to go fuck themselves. In that video, we reported that all 13 border guards were killed while trying to surrender, while Russian media claimed that the island was home to 87 Ukrainian soldiers, who were all subsequently captured. As it turns out, the truth was somewhere in the middle, as although there were only 13 occupants, they were indeed captured by Russian forces. It's currently unclear where exactly they are as of time of writing, as some believe that they could still be in Russian custody, while others speculate that they could have been part of one of the several prisoner exchanges that have been conducted since the start of the war. This brings us to the war itself, which likely hasn't been tracking the way President Putin would have liked. On the northern front, a 64-kilometer Russian convoy was spotted earlier in the month, presumably to remedy its infamously poor logistics situation, which have seen Russian troops short on necessities such as food, ammunition, and fuel. A push for the capital of Kiev would be made from several surrounding cities. However, this would ultimately be repelled by a Ukrainian counterattack, which would go on to recapture a number of small towns to the east and west of the capital. The northeast, on the other hand, has been more successful for the Russian military, as its flat and sparsely populated terrain makes it excellent for tanks and other mechanized forces to thrive. Some experts believe that this would be the most successful angle of attack to make a serious push into Kiev. To the eastern front, the second largest city in the country has remained under the control of Ukraine, which is especially impressive when considering it's only 35 kilometers from the Russian border. The city of Mariupol is also closely contested, which made headlines after a Russian airstrike would kill an estimated 300 people gathered inside a theater. Russia would officially deny the attack. To the south, Russian forces would capture Kherson, marking the first major Ukrainian city captured during the invasion. Feeling lucky, this force would then attempt to capture Mykolaiv 2 days later, only to be stopped and later repelled by a counterattack. Ukrainian citizens themselves have also made life quite difficult for invading soldiers, with many crafting Molotov cocktails, creating barricades for tanks, and taking down road signs to confuse navigators. Unfortunately, this has led to forced disappearances, hostage taking, mock executions, and cases of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers. Determining casualties for the war has also proved to be nearly impossible, as everyone seems to have an incentive to underplay or exaggerate specific figures. For example, at around the tail end of March, Russia had reported it had suffered around 5,000 casualties, while the United States estimated around 15 to 22,000, while NATO put the number somewhere between 30 to 40,000. On the other hand, Russia claims that around 14,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed, while Ukraine has reported losses of around a tenth of this number. The truth is that we have no idea how many people have lost their lives in this conflict, and this likely won't be truly known for a long time into the future. As much as troop numbers, training, and logistics have a huge impact on the outcome of a war, we also can't discount the sizable impact of the international community as a whole. In a UN vote on the 3rd of March, 193 member states had their chance to either condemn or support the invasion. However, as we found, it was a bit disheartening to list every single country who voted in support of Russian aggression. We thought it would be more appropriate to use the 1993 Yakos World Song to make things a bit more fun. Viewers should keep in mind that North Korea, Belarus, and Eritrea weren't included in the song, likely as most of them were new countries by the time the episode aired, so we'll just have to put those to the side. With that out of the way, sit back and relax, as we list every country formally in support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And now, the nations of the world, brought to you by Yakko Warner.
Syria.
Well, I may have gone too far in a few places.
To the relief of both Krusty the editor and the wider world, this list turned out to be laughably short. On the other hand, 141 member states called for the immediate withdrawal of Russian forces, while 35 chose to abstain. In the interest of time, Yakko's World can't sit this one out. Sanctions efforts also ramped up over the month of March, with nearly all Russian airlines and private flights being banned from UK, US, and European Union airspaces. The European Union would also ban Russian state-owned television networks from the bloc, which, as we touched on last month, was filled with a fair amount of straight-up propaganda. Even the fiercely neutral Switzerland imposed targeted sanctions of Russian companies and individuals, freezing any assets within the nation. South Korea and Japan piled onto the shit show, which mainly targeted financial institutions and the export of key military components, such as semiconductors. The British government would later unveil its biggest sanction package in the nation's history, including asset freezes on both Russian banks and extremely wealthy Russian individuals. Canada would also adopt a targeted approach to 62 Russian elites, as well as prioritize immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to move to the country outright. These sanctions continue with the Czech Republic, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, but this is all still the tip of the iceberg. At the tail end of February, British multinational company, BP, the single largest foreign investor in Russia, would announce that it would be divesting from Russian state-owned oil company, Rosneft, which comprises around half of BP's oil and gas reserves. That same day, the government pension of Norway, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, would divest itself from Russian assets, totaling around $2.8 billion. What followed was an absolute avalanche of divestment from the nation, including Shell and some of the world's largest shipping companies, who would cease all shipments outside of essential goods, such as medical supplies, foodstuffs, and humanitarian supplies. Other industries would soon follow the trend of getting the hell out of Russia.
Look, Pim, I know it's our job to help this guy and everything, but I think this guy's a lost cause. He's obviously made up his mind. Why don't we just cut our losses and get out of here?
And for the average citizen, this has made doing the simplest of things exceptionally hard. Theoretically, a Russian man named Ivan could wake up one day and find out that all of his international packages from UPS, FedEx, and DHL have been cancelled. Sad and defeated, he goes to get himself some comfort food, but finds that McDonald's, Starbucks, Pizza Hut, and KFC are no longer open. Ivan eventually finds a nice restaurant he likes, but because Visa, MasterCard, and American Express have all pulled out, he has to pay in cash, which is now worth around half of what it was at the start of the year. Our theoretical Russian man then tries to buy himself a snazzy new outfit, but with international brands like TJ Maxx and Adidas suspending operation, he might find this endeavor just as frustrating. Defeated, our handsome Russian lad tries to relax, but as he would soon find out, Microsoft, Sony, and Netflix would all be part of the divestment wave and no longer be offering their services within the country. These are only a handful of businesses that have ceased to operate within Russia, and the longer the invasion continues, the longer citizens are forced to become increasingly isolated from the modern, ever-connected world. In response to hundreds of brands pulling out, there have been talks to start nationalizing these assets within the country, meaning the Russian government would simply take everything a company owned within their borders. This does, however, come with some pretty insane consequences, as obviously no company on the face of the planet would choose to invest in a country which might decide to steal their assets at the drop of a hat. Much like every decision President Putin has made since the start of this war, it has been very carefully and meticulously calculated, but holy shit, is he bad at math. A hotly debated topic in recent years has been the extent to which social media giants should be limiting what's posted on their platforms. With these networks now becoming a kind of infrastructure through which people communicate and discover information, these online platforms have become public settings for anyone to have a voice. In many cases, this has meant that the platforms themselves, and not lawmakers, have become responsible for filtering what should and shouldn't be allowed, and this isn't always an easy call to make. As we've seen recently, some social media sites have begun fact-checking news sources, which, although designed to mitigate some of its truly destructive potential, has brought into question who exactly would become the arbiter of truth.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
In the modern age, this kind of power, which has seemingly landed into the laps of social media giants, tends to become even more complicated in wartime, as Meta, the parent company to Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, made a temporary change to its content policy this month, allowing users to call for violence upon Russian soldiers. It should be noted that this policy is only specifically allowed in Ukraine, requires the content to be put into context of the war, and prohibits the violence to be directed at any civilians. Russian prosecutors would be quick to respond to this change, branding the US tech giant an extremist organization, and would later restrict access to both Instagram and Facebook. This decision appeared to be a long time coming, as Russia cited 26 cases of supposed discrimination against Russian media since October 2020. Russia's embassy in the US would make a tweet on the decision, saying, quote, "Users of Facebook and Instagram did not give the owners of these platforms the right to determine the criteria of truth and pit nations against each other." Perhaps the only thing more shocking than the invasion of Ukraine itself was the sheer magnitude of the hypocrisy in that statement alone. As it currently stands, Russian citizens who are accused of sharing supposed fake information of the war can face up to 15 years in prison, which means anything deviating from Putin's bullshit excuse that Russia is liberating Ukraine from being overtaken by Nazis. Even the average Call of Duty campaign is more subtle than this shit. As it turns out, making up excuses for invading a country which have close ties to each other has the potential to backfire when the truth is revealed. Since the start of the invasion, there have been numerous reports of captured Russian soldiers who have become furious when told that the supposed special military operation was indeed an invasion. When asked about why they were there, some Russian prisoners were told that they were simply part of military exercises, while others were assured that they'd be welcomed as liberators, going as far as expecting cheers and flowers. When asked what he would say to his fellow soldiers and Russians back home, one captured officer replied, quote, "Everything we were told was a fake. I would tell my guys to leave Ukrainian territory. We've got families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go home." Another Russian captive was less eloquent in his response, as when asked what he would tell his commanders in light of the revelation, he simply replied, "They are faggots." End quote. According to an advisor of a former Ukrainian prime minister, Russian soldiers are broadly divided into two categories. The first are the career soldiers. These are usually older guys who have fought in Syria or the Donbass regions of Ukraine since 2014. The second category are the younger conscripts, who the advisor describes as, quote, "scared shitless." These poor motherfuckers were born as early as 2002, meaning some of them weren't even around before Attack of the Clones was released in cinemas. A lot of these guys are fucking teenagers who have no idea why they're even there, sent off to be cannon fodder in a pointless fucking war. In some cases, when Russian prisoners are allowed to ring home to their families, their parents don't even know that they're in Ukraine in the first place, and Ukrainian authorities have opened a hotline for worried Russian relatives for this exact reason. Since the start of the invasion, over 3 million Ukrainians have fled the country, mostly to neighboring Poland, but others have sought safe havens all over the world. By an insane stroke of luck, I stumbled upon one such refugee, who ended up in Australia, a young woman named Elizabeth, who was willing to give her experience of the invasion. Elizabeth and her family lived in Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, and when looking at a map, is also really fucking close to the Russian border. At 5 AM on the 24th of February, she was woken up by a call from her mother, telling her about the initial bombing. Hastily packing for an evacuation, their family regrouped at a single household and went out for emergency supplies like food and petrol, with the panic to get into these stores taking as long as 40 minutes. While at the petrol station, they would witness their local airport being bombed and would later end up spending several hours sheltering in a nearby metro before they could get home. After a rough night of sleep, it was decided that evacuating via train would be the best course of action. Their escape from Kharkov had begun. As Elizabeth's father was a doctor, he decided to stay behind to help those in need, while her grandparents also stayed put due to health concerns. The rest of the family boarded a train headed to Lviv, near the Polish border, but getting there would mean going straight through the capital of Kiev, which Russian forces would actively bomb on their way through. After sitting tight in a train carriage filled with 3 times the recommended number of passengers, they would eventually make it to Lviv before taking a bus into Poland the following day. Since landing in Australia, Elizabeth has been worried about her family, her pets, and her country. Within a week of arrival, she's attempted to find a job to support herself, which has proved to be impossible with her current visa restrictions. The most insane part of this story is that, as crazy as it is, it's just one from several million people who have desperately attempted to flee the country, and the majority who are still living, working, and fighting within Ukraine. The human toll this conflict has had on the regular citizens of Ukraine has been outright extraordinary, and even after hearing this story of someone go through so much hardship to uproot their entire life, I can't help think that Elizabeth and her family were some of the lucky ones. On a side note, after letting sheer curiosity get the better of me, I would also show Elizabeth the infamous 5 TikTok dances you can do to help Ukraine fight Russia, to which she would respond, quote, "I don't see that before, is it for hype? I don't think it's to help the Ukrainians." After extensive research by the entire team, Elizabeth's assumptions would be conclusively proven correct. As you might imagine, not all shots fired in the war over Ukraine came from a gun, which was most evident when the head of Ukraine's anti-corruption agency personally thanked Moscow's top defense official for being so terrible at his job. Head of Ukraine's National Agency on Corruption Prevention, Alexander Novikov, addressed Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu directly, stating that his embezzlement of public funds had made an invaluable contribution to the defense of his country. In the letter, he wrote, quote, "Russian means and support resources for the attack on Ukraine were stolen even before they were accumulated on the border of the 2 states. It's no secret that Russian forces have faced severe logistical challenges since the start of the invasion, with Russian soldiers seen to be asking local residents for food, looting grocery stores, and according to a reporter from the New York Times, being sent with rations which expired in 2002, the same year some of these soldiers were born. There have also been reports that some Russian soldiers were initially only equipped with 3 days worth of rations. However, we weren't able to verify this particular claim. Corruption is, of course, a huge fundamental threat to any functional country, as it essentially makes it impossible to distribute funds correctly and fill the most important positions with the most talented individuals. We've covered this topic on the channel before, but Russia has proven itself to be notoriously corrupt, with Transparency International ranking it 136th. Falling below Kenya, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. With this in mind, Ukraine doesn't exactly score that much better, coming in only 17 places higher. In fact, a huge part of President Zelensky's election campaign was to specifically weed out corruption. However, it appears that despite his best efforts, Ukraine has only managed to climb 4 places in the international rankings since taking office. Although actively at war, Ukraine's National Agency for the Protection Against Corruption would announce a particularly unique tax incentive, stating that all combat trophies would not need to be declared as part of a citizen's personal income. This will likely most apply to smaller trinkets collected. However, much larger acquisitions were also specifically cited, including military equipment and larger abandoned vehicles, which Ukrainian farmers have made a habit of towing away with tractors. Although there were initially claims that one such farmer had attempted to sell a captured T-72 tank on eBay, this was later discovered to be false. It seems that anyone who might be in the market for a Soviet-era war machine might be waiting a little longer for the opportunity. An underreported dimension of the invasion of Ukraine has been the surge of foreign fighters who have joined on both sides of the conflict. On the side of Russia, these international fighters are almost entirely made up of mercenaries, which have been recruited from both regions in Africa and the Middle East. The bulk of these forces seem to be from Syria, a country which has been the backdrop of a bloody civil war for over a decade, with Russia playing a significant part. Reports vary on how much these foreign fighters are paid for their service, but we found figures ranging anywhere from $400 to $3,000 a month, depending on experience. In almost all cases, this earning potential is significantly higher than Syrian citizens can make locally, and in some cases, actually pays better than low-ranking positions in the Russian army. A much less significant, but more specialized force comes from a private military organization, more specifically, Wagner Group. The group was supposedly founded in 2014 by a Russian lieutenant colonel from the Spetsnaz arm of the Russian military named Dmitry Valeryevich Utkin, and was initially contracted to protect Syrian oil fields. The name Wagner Group was even named after Utkin's own call sign, which derives its name from German composer Richard Wagner. As innocent as this sounds, this is supposedly because of Utkin's admiration for Adolf Hitler, as Richard Wagner was his favorite composer. Setting the irony of Vladimir Putin's Nazi-based excuse to invade aside, Utkin would later be photographed with Putin in 2016, and many believe that the group serves as a kind of black ops arm of the Russian military, where plausible deniability is of the utmost importance. It's not currently known how large this force has become, as the best estimates we have are for 5,000 troops as of 2017, but these guys have been fucking everywhere. Wagner Group has been involved in Syria, the Donbass region of Ukraine, Libya, the Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali, and even Venezuela. When Vladimir Putin needs something done, but doesn't want any fingerprints, he calls Wagner Group, and these guys have been known to do anything from providing protection for an allied head of state, the training of local fighters, suppressing protests, and even torturing and executing people, if the need arises. It's currently unclear how much of a presence Wagner Group has within Ukraine, as reliable information is near impossible to find. However, according to the Ukrainian military, members of the organization had allegedly orchestrated at least 2 separate assassination attempts on President Zelensky. It's difficult to say just how many foreign mercenaries Russia has deployed overall, as the Syrian president has promised to provide as many as 40,000. Russia has approved around 16,000, while the United States reported that they have not seen an influx of Middle Eastern fighters join the Ukrainian front. This isn't to say that there isn't a significant foreign presence on the side of Ukraine. For obvious reasons, countries around the world are hesitant to join the war themselves, but this doesn't stop them from sending military aid like supplies and equipment, as long as Ukrainian citizens are pulling the trigger. The biggest contributor by far, to no one's surprise, has been the United States, when early in the month, $13.6 billion in military and humanitarian assistance was passed in the House of Representatives in a one-sided vote of 36-69. Beyond financial aid, just because a country can't officially become involved, doesn't mean private citizens can't do so themselves. In many cases, this means humanitarian help, with volunteer doctors lending their skills, but it also means that combat veterans themselves are converging on the war-torn nation. As it stands, Ukraine has an international legion of foreign fighters, which has received around 20,000 expressions of interest to join. The legion is made up of fighters from 52 countries from around the world, with their reasons for joining as varied as the individuals themselves. Many in countries close to Ukraine see the invasion as the first step in a wider Russian campaign, and that if Ukraine falls, so too could their own homeland. This doesn't mean that there aren't a significant number of recruits from outside the continent, with at least 550 Canadians joining Ukrainian forces, enough to form their own official battalion. Among them is a man being called Wally, who is supposedly the sniper who claims the longest confirmed kill in history, at over 3.5 kilometers. Confirming anything about this guy was nearly fucking impossible, as anything outside of the basics were usually from pretty shaky sources, but even having this guy on the ground is a pretty terrifying thought. As a Russian soldier, the United States has also confirmed that around 4,000 citizens have joined the International Legion, which appears to be the most of any country, at least officially. US veterans have their own reasons for joining the war, with many citing humanitarian motives, but for many on their way to Ukraine, it's more personal. A large number of these volunteers are veterans who did tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many of those either didn't see action or simply feel more at home in the thick of combat. There's also the fact that many veterans who served in the Middle East have become particularly jaded after those particular conflicts. The invasion of Iraq was predicated on a lie, and even after 20 years in Afghanistan, the nation became the least democratic country on earth as soon as US troops pulled out of the region. In many ways, Russia invading Ukraine is such a black and white conflict in comparison, meaning veterans of these wars see fighting alongside Ukraine as a kind of internal redemption after being left disillusioned by their time in the military. The process of joining the Legion of Foreign Fighters is much more straightforward than you might expect, as the requirements are to just have previous military or law enforcement experience before showing up at a collection point. This becomes a bit more complicated depending on the country, however, as although most don't expressly prohibit citizens from serving, they certainly don't recommend it either. In the United States, for example, it's legal to become a foreign fighter as long as it's not for a group who opposes Uncle Sam. However, the Biden administration has strongly discouraged citizens from doing so, instead encouraging Americans to donate to humanitarian organizations. Determining the number of unofficial foreign fighters is also nearly impossible, as in many cases, individuals are simply flying to Poland and crossing into Ukraine on their own. This might be because joining Ukraine's Foreign Legion requires applicants to sign a 3-year contract, which is designed to give individuals the legal protection of the Ukrainian government. Under international law, when a combatant is wounded or captured, they are protected from things like torture, degrading treatment, and cannot be used as hostages. However, without these legal protections, they could be shit out of luck. Russian forces have already committed several war crimes since the start of this short conflict, so it stands to reason that they probably wouldn't act too kindly if they captured a random foreign fighter without a flag on their shoulder. We now once again come to the Ukrainian invasion, which we'll start by looking at what's changed on the ground. In the north, Ukrainian counterattacks have managed to remove the majority of Russian presence from the region, forcing them to the Belarusian border or into western Russia. As it stands, the capital of Kiev is relatively safe. In the south, however, Russia has remained far more successful, making the most of its rapid gains in the first weeks of the invasion. This momentum has, however, been significantly slowed by strong resistance from the cities of Mykolaiv in the west and Mariupol in the east. Mariupol itself has been fully encircled since the start of March, and as of time of writing at the end of April, the city is now mostly under control of Russian forces. According to the local mayor, the shelling of the city has led to at least 20,000 civilians dead, although this cannot be confirmed due to the fog of war. The east of the country now appears to be the focus of the invasion, where in the Donbass region, Russian-backed separatists had already controlled a significant amount of territory pre-invasion. Whether this is a tactical massing of forces, or whether Russia underestimated its capabilities in the north, still remains to be seen. For the third month in a row, the story of Snake Island continues to unfold, and if this shit doesn't end up in Ukrainian folklore for generations to come, then they're doing themselves a disservice. The island became famous in the first few days of the invasion, when its 13 Ukrainian guardsmen were ordered to surrender by the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, a vessel named Moskva. The guardsmen would then reply with the now famous line, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself," before later being captured, then subsequently returned home in a prisoner exchange at the end of March. This story would become even more interesting in the middle of April, when it would be reported that the Moskva had been sunk. According to reports, the vessel was evacuated after it was hit by an anti-ship missile, which would lead to the ship becoming unseaworthy. Supposedly, the ship officially sank while it was being towed to a friendly port. However, it would then sustain heavy damage after losing balance, causing its store of ammunition to explode. As expected, the reports from both Russia and Ukraine would cover the incident differently. According to Russian state media, the ship did indeed sink. However, it was merely the cause of a fire, with no attack being mentioned. Ukrainian media, on the other hand, reported that not only was the ship hit by a Ukrainian missile, but the explosion also killed the ship's captain, a claim we weren't able to verify. One man who didn't believe the official Russian reports was Vladimir Bortko, a Russian film director and former politician, who was rightfully convinced that the sinking of the Moskva was the result of a Ukrainian attack. He would then go on to make himself look like an absolute dumbass by insisting that Russia should go to war with Ukraine over the incident and that Russia's trademarked special military operation that definitely isn't a war doesn't go far enough. In all honesty, the sinking of the Moskva is more of a symbolic defeat than a tactical setback. The vessel was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. It housed a crew of over 500, and it now stands as the nation's biggest warship to be sunk in action since the Second World War. The ship was however critical to support others within its fleet, and it was the only ship in the region with long-range anti-air defenses on board. Although the Moskva is now by far the biggest ship sunk during the invasion, we'd be lying if we said that the war at sea wasn't very much in Russia's favor. On the water, Russia has seen 2 of its ships taken out completely and 2 more damaged. On the other hand, Ukraine has had 8 unidentified ships sunk, 1 patrol boat taken down, 5 boats captured, its command ship damaged, and the nation's flagship scuttled to not fall into enemy hands. A part of the invasion which has only recently come to light are so-called filtration camps, where Russian forces will process Ukrainian civilians before figuring out what to do with them. Thousands of civilians have flocked to these camps, as in many cases, it's their only way of evacuating, without the risk of trying to cross the border. Ukrainians who have been through these camps say that photos are taken of them from all sides, their fingerprints are recorded, and they are then interrogated for hours while being processed. Before arriving at these camps, people usually clear out their phone of anything that might be considered in support of Ukraine, as these are also checked upon arrival. According to a couple interviewed, if the interrogators suspected that a person had Nazi ties, they could then be taken to be tortured or executed, although this couldn't be verified independently. In any case, this proves that the Nazi-based excuse of invading seems to be believed by Russians on the ground. Even as we've previously covered, the rate of neo-Nazi activity is almost identical within Russia and Ukraine. Within the camps, the conditions were described to be horrific. Elderly people slept on the floor without mattresses. Thousands of people had to share the same toilet and sink, and soap and disinfectant were entirely absent. Evacuation buses to the west of Ukraine were said to be extremely inconsistent, but on the other hand, transport offered into Russia was freely available, and some within the camps were even forced onto the Russian-bound coaches. It was said that the elderly and disabled were usually allowed to leave quickly, as they weren't perceived to be as much of a risk. However, young people detained could expect to stay much longer. Alternatively, others were able to escape with the help of local drivers, who were able to map out routes across the country using dirt roads, fields, and narrow pathways. Some of these drivers needed to get around as many as 12 checkpoints before making it out safely. As it stands, 11 million Ukrainians have been displaced by the conflict. One dimension of the war we've yet to cover is the sheer amount of war crimes that have been committed since the start of this relatively infant conflict. On the second day of the invasion, Amnesty International had already reported that Russian troops were using cluster missiles, which have been heavily criticized for being absurdly indiscriminate weapons. To put it into perspective, historically 98% of cluster missile casualties are civilians, with 27% of those being children. It's hard to even comprehend a weapon system that could be more statistically indiscriminate if you tried. One of the most famous war crimes of the conflict is the Bucha massacre, which was only brought to light at the start of April. The city of Bucha was captured by Russian forces on the 12th of March, only to be recaptured by the end of the same month. But upon returning, Ukrainian forces found 500 bodies within the area, many of which were civilians who had their hands tied before being shot in the back of the head. A further investigation found a basement being used as a torture chamber, bodies mutilated and burned, and corpses being booby-trapped to be found later. By the 9th of April, Ukrainian forensic investigators began recovering bodies from mass graves. The fact that this happened isn't even in dispute, with drone footage, satellite analysis, and eyewitnesses all piecing together the short but brutal occupation of the city. And in talking to The Economist, one eyewitness even pretended to be dead to escape capture. To say that these war criminals were caught in 4K would be a blatant understatement. As could be expected, Russia has officially denied responsibility for the massacre and instead claimed that the entire event was staged by Ukrainian forces to make Russia look bad. Like we've been saying, since the start of this conflict, these kinds of responses aren't aimed at the wider world and are more so directed at Russian citizens themselves, who don't have the free access of information to easily discredit these claims. One aspect that might be overlooked during such a conflict is the scale of sexual violence being committed across the country. Many of the victims of these crimes are unfortunately killed as a result, and there's been evidence that some have been witnessed by young children. Some outlets have stated that children as young as 11 have also been victim to this same treatment. However, by following only rock-solid sources, the youngest we could find was a case in Bucha involving a 14-year-old girl. This doesn't mean that Ukraine has been entirely free of criminal activity, and this mostly has to do with its treatment of prisoners. Viewers might remember videos of Russian soldiers we showed last month who vented their rage after discovering that the reason for invading was all predicated on a lie. As it turns out, filming these prisoners is actually against Article 13 of the Geneva Convention, which shields prisoners from, quote, insults and public curiosity. Other incidents have been far more serious, including a video uploaded at the end of March, which appears to show Ukrainian soldiers shoot Russian prisoners in the kneecaps. This incident is being investigated by both Ukrainian and Russian officials. However, Ukraine's armed forces chief would later claim that Russia had been staging videos in order to discredit Ukrainian defense forces. In all honesty, we have no idea what happened in this incident. On the other hand, a video of a Georgian volunteer executing Russian soldiers seemed to be far more legitimate, and to our knowledge, no party has disputed the validity of the video. Other crimes include unconfirmed deployment of chemical weapons, the deportation of around 700,000 Ukrainian civilians, general looting, the apparent use of children as human shields, and the destruction of cultural landmarks. In all honesty, these are just a handful of the instances of war crimes which have been committed up until now, and I suspect we could probably make an entire video dedicated to individual accounts if it wasn't so overwhelmingly depressing. Viewers who have been watching for an extended period of time may remember Alexander Lukashenko, the undisputed leader of Belarus, who's long been allies to Vladimir Putin himself. Aside from becoming famous for his signature look as a used car salesman, Lukashenko also made headlines in August 2020 when he would rig the nation's election and force nearly every opposition leader to either flee into exile or outright go missing. The ensuing protests would later be quelled with the help of Russian support, making Lukashenko a kind of mini-boss before you could take down Putin at the end of the game.
I don't know what I'm doing! Ah! Shit! Fuck me! Shit! What the fuck?
If Putin is Godric the Grafted, Lukashenko is more like Margit, and as long as we're doubling down on Elden Ring comparisons, Vladimir Zelensky would probably be General Radan. Since the start of the invasion, Lukashenko has allowed Belarus to act as a staging point from where Russian troops have made their advance from the north, but due to overwhelming public outcry, the nation has stopped short of actually providing support with its own armed forces. This month, however, Mr. Lukashenko seemingly expressed doubts about the invasion, stating that not only has this so-called special military operation dragged on, but that he would not consider himself immersed enough to know whether it was even going to plan. Days later, in the middle of the month, Mr. Lukashenko would attend a summit of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is pretty much Putin's fan club, made up of Russia, Belarus, Armenia, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Tajikistan. If you bought NATO from Wish, you'd probably get these guys delivered to your door. During the summit, Lukashenko would announce that had the other members pulled their weight with the invasion, Belarus wouldn't be suffering such harsh sanctions, which as of right now, have amounted from anywhere between 16 to 18 billion in annual exports to Western nations. He would then go on to double down on Russia's bullshit excuse to invade, stating that the reason NATO has been supporting Ukraine in the war is because its members are made up of Nazis who are still scared to openly fight the heirs of those who defeated them in World War II. We'd once again like to remind viewers that the reason these claims are so obviously outlandish isn't to convince those with any amount of intelligence, but rather to reinforce these beliefs within Russia, where the flow of information has already been heavily restricted. Viewers who want to keep up with all the funniest claims by Putin and his allies can be sure to click the bell icon below, and we'll personally deliver a notification every time we have a new video to share. Meanwhile, fast food restaurants are sued for making food look bigger. A state representative for Oklahoma proposes mandatory vasectomies, and US mass shootings are down when compared to the same month last year. Sticking with the United States, and the start of this month saw a leaked landmark decision by the Supreme Court, which showed a vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. The 1973 Roe v. Wade case quite famously ruled that the US Constitution would protect a woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. The ruling would pass at a vote of 7-2, which is especially significant because there have only been a handful of rulings in the court's history which have been this lopsided. Although this new decision to overturn this now 50-year-old ruling is not yet official, members of the Supreme Court have confirmed its legitimacy, meaning if all else holds true, abortion will not be protected federally sometime into the future. As viewers probably expect, the news caused an uproar among the American populace almost immediately, with protests breaking out the very same day that the leak was confirmed to be legitimate. The abortion debate within the United States has long proved one of the most controversial policies within the country, and much of this has to do with its complexity. Abortion advocates argue that banning abortion restricts freedom for women and tends to lead to worse outcomes for children who may not have had parents who are properly equipped to raise a family. Advocates also argue that the demand for abortion is inelastic, meaning whether legal or not, people who want an abortion will get them, regardless of the law, whether this means traveling to somewhere where the practice is legal, or undertaking much more dangerous alternatives. According to a study released by a pro-choice policy institute in 2018, 22,000 women die from unsafe abortions every year, most of which occur in developing nations. On the other hand, advocates against abortion argue that the rights of the unborn begin before the start of the first trimester of pregnancy. By definition, this means that any abortion would be the equivalent to murdering someone on the street, which is why those against the practice are so horrified at the prospect. As you might have noticed, the problem behind the abortion debate is that it's very much a question of ethics. What this means is that people from both sides are usually stuck in a perpetual state of disagreement, as they are essentially arguing over entirely different topics. Another fun part of this debate is down to the general wackiness of the Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices, who are all appointed for life, and are all elected by the US president at the time. Despite what you might think, Supreme Court justices don't actually need any specific qualifications, meaning theoretically, an Italian-born 19-year-old who never finished high school could be appointed if they somehow got through the screening process. All of this combined also means that the collective opinion of the Supreme Court is up to RNG. This is because when justices either die or retire from the position, they are then replaced by whoever happens to be president at the time, and although the president can't tell them how to vote, they can instead choose people who politically align with their party. As you might imagine, this has led to a strange game of musical chairs, where the party in power is incentivized to fill as many seats as possible, with ideally the youngest appointees they can. The founding fathers would be proud. The decision to overturn Roe v. Wade could simply be a sign of the times, while others have argued that the initial reasoning was fundamentally weak in the first place. In any case, the ruling to overturn the decision won't actually outlaw the practice within the United States, but rather, it will allow the states to choose for themselves whether the practice should remain legal within their jurisdiction. Judging by the current divisive state of US politics, the abortion question for each state is very likely to come down to whether their favorite color is blue or red. Coming back to Ukraine, and we'll first check in on the situation on the ground. After Russia's failed attempt to push into the capital of Kiev early in the invasion, they now appear to have committed to its more promising progress in the east and south of the country. Russia now controls roughly 90% of the eastern Luhansk region, as well as much of neighboring Donetsk, and with the siege of Mariupol ending with a Russian victory, it appears as if the entire Donbass region could soon be entirely occupied. In the north, however, the country's second largest city of Kharkov has been completely retaken by Ukrainian forces since fighting began at the end of February. You could say that Russia made their escape from Kharkov. With that fun joke out of the way, let's talk about genocide. According to a report from 30 internationally recognized legal scholars and experts, Russia is guilty of both inciting and having the intent to commit genocide, which would legally oblige other countries to step to the defense of Ukraine. The report found that there were reasonable grounds to conclude that Russia is in breach of two specific articles of the 1948 Genocide Convention by not only forcibly transferring Ukrainian children to Russia, but by publicly inciting genocide within the country. Russian leadership and Russian state media have consistently incited resentment for those within Ukraine, frequently denying the existence of a distinct Ukrainian identity and implying that those who self-identify as Ukrainian are a threat to the unity of Russia. The report also looked into the language used by Russian officials when depicting the Ukrainian people, with terms like zombified, bestial, subordinate, and scum, all intended to make Ukrainians seem subhuman. For a government who wants its people to believe that they've launched a military campaign to fight Nazis, they're certainly acting very Nazi-like. Within the Swag News team, we tend to be very opinionated on certain topics and don't always agree on certain issues and beliefs, but we do our best to filter this out during the final product. Our video on the last US election, for example, was rewritten and combed over twice to minimize bias, but to even pretend that Russia isn't morally reprehensible in this invasion would be lying to ourselves and you as an audience. The Russian state have deported over 1 million Ukrainians into Russia, used some of the most indiscriminate weapons known to man, targeted civilians, cultural landmarks, hospitals, and power plants, and have kidnapped, sexually abused, tortured, and executed hundreds of innocent civilians since the start of their bullshit invasion. Vladimir Putin has now sent over 15,000 of his own people to die in this pointless war, most of who were conscripted soldiers who were born after the year 2000 and were told they would be greeted as liberators to the people of Ukraine. In the end, no amount of whataboutism by Russian trolls or mental gymnastics by people with half a brain cell could possibly justify the sheer level of evil that Russian leadership has put on display. In terms of international developments, this month saw the United States dwarf its previous $13 billion emergency measure as it would go on to sign off on a $40 billion package to assist Ukraine in its own defense. Much like previous packages, the legislation passed through Congress virtually unopposed, and it aims to provide $20 billion in military assistance, $8 billion in economic support, $5 billion to address global food shortages, and $1 billion to assist refugees. The amount of money the United States has given to Ukraine has inadvertently highlighted Russia's comparatively tiny economy, as the $50 billion sent in the past 4 months is the equivalent to around 75% of Russia's entire 2021 military budget. We've mentioned this before, but the US actually has 3 whole states whose individual economies are bigger than the entirety of Russia. Fucking wild. Moving away from Uncle Sam, the European Union has also been hard at work with their own projects to make Putin's life a little more stressful, as the EU have proposed a new and exciting wave of sanctions, the most significant of which would phase out all Russian oil by the end of the year. On both sides of this deal, the results are going to sting like a bitch. In Germany, for example, Russian oil supplies roughly 1/3 of its electrical grid, meaning the nation will have to start importing from more expensive alternatives while it intensifies its push toward renewable energy. Russia, on the other hand, looks to be just as fucked as Europe, as oil and gas exports make up a staggering 40% of the country's federal budget reserves. This means that Russia will have to either diversify its economy in a time where 1/3 of the world refuses to do business, or settle for selling its natural resources to alternative buyers at a reduced rate. In another surprising twist of events, the Scandinavian nations of Finland and Sweden have formally requested to join NATO, which follows nearly a century of neutrality. In what initially seemed to be a process which would be almost immediately approved, the two soon-to-be members would later be blocked by Turkey, who would criticize the two countries of harboring militant separatists who aim to establish an independent state within the country. A lot of this is caught up in Turkey supporting a different faction in the Syrian civil war, which at this point is just that Simpsons gag, where everyone is betting on the two monkeys fighting to the death. As new NATO members need to be unanimously accepted, this has led many to believe that Turkey is using this opportunity to leverage these applications as a political tool. Others have speculated that Turkish President Erdogan is simply using the applications as an opportunity to boost his domestic popularity at a time where the Turkish economy is particularly weak and the next election is only a year away. In any case, most commenters believe that both Sweden and Finland will eventually be approved to join NATO, meaning in the event they get attacked, they'll immediately have the full military support of most of Europe, Canada, and the United States, something that Ukraine didn't have at the time of the invasion. We now check in on Ukraine, which is unfortunately just as fucked as last month. The Russian military have continued their assault on the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which lie in the heart of the Donbass region in the far east of the country. If Russia is able to take these cities, then thousands of Ukrainian troops will be cut off without reinforcements, which will give Russia a strong foothold in the Donbass. In the south, a Russian advance to the port city of Odessa was pushed back by Ukrainian forces, momentum that Ukraine hopes to use to recapture Kherson, a city just north of Crimea. In the north, the Ukrainian military has officially liberated the city of Kharkov and have begun to push east. However, the destruction within the city has been severe, with over 2,000 buildings left completely destroyed. As a consequence of the war, the grain outputs of both Russia and Ukraine have taken a severe dive, and this shortage has started to severely affect the regions of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. This is a bit of a problem, because nations such as Egypt and Nigeria were already struggling with a food shortage, while Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia would be forgiven for believing that shit couldn't get much worse. In the Horn of Africa, experts predict that 20 million people could go hungry by the end of the year, while the nation of Yemen already relies on international aid to feed 13 million people. Unfortunately, the agency that provides the most in aid, the World Food Programme, buys half of all of its wheat from Ukraine and has already been forced to suspend support to the war-torn nation of South Sudan due to this grain shortage. It's hoped that the upcoming harvest seasons in both the United States and India will be able to offset these losses, but recent droughts and heat waves will likely hinder production. Ukraine itself hasn't been without fresh support either, as since last month, the United States has promised an additional $1 billion in munitions and humanitarian aid, while the nations of Germany, Denmark, and the United Kingdom have also committed to further military support. China on the other hand have taken a different stance to the invasion, as leader of the country and beloved anthropomorphic bear, Winnie the Pooh, spoke publicly in support of the Russian invasion. This contradicts previous statements by the leader, who previously encouraged a ceasefire and even reprimanded Russia's illegal offensive campaign into Ukraine. Experts believe that this change in tone could be due to China's military buildup in the South China Sea, which is of course home to the nation of Taiwan, a region that China still believes it owns. This is of course pure speculation for the time being. If there's anything we can say for sure about this now 4-month-long conflict, it's that waging war is really fucking expensive. However, some Ukrainian soldiers have come up with a unique way of raising some extra cash. Through the messaging app Telegram, a member of the Ukrainian resistance announced that for a $40 donation, generous patrons can have their own personalized message written on a 152mm artillery shell. Since the fundraiser began, the platoon that pioneered this enterprise have reportedly raised around $18,000 as of time of writing, money which was enough to buy 2 Starlink systems, a pickup truck, and a thermal light. Welcome to an age where we can turn shitposts into legitimate weapons of war. When we look at the war in Ukraine, It's often easy to get caught up in tanks, troop movements, and enormous relief packages, but there's also been a lot of smaller stories that have gone largely unreported. Within Russia itself, a proposal by a pro-Putin political party has called for the leader to be referred to as Russia's ruler, as opposed to the president. The nation's nationalist Liberal Democratic Party argues that the term president is a foreign word that has not taken root in Russia. A Kremlin spokesperson would later tell reporters that this proposal is still in the discussion stage and that Vladimir Putin has given no opinion on the matter. When the title of president is supposed to mean the elected head of a republic, it would be far more accurate to call Putin a ruler anyway, and keeping the title is likely a way of projecting the illusion of choice to the people of Russia. In other news within Russia, according to lawyers and rights activists within the country, rates of conscription avoidance have spiked dramatically since the start of the invasion. Even before the conflict began, military service was mandatory for all men aged between 18 and 27, which required them to register into the military. Around a third of those compulsory registrations would be required to serve their year-long draft, many of whom would be subject to hazing rituals, which still remain as a brutal relic of the Soviet Union. Officially, conscripts are generally prohibited from being deployed abroad. However, there's been ample evidence that conscripted soldiers have both fought and died in the war over Ukraine. For the young men within Russia looking to dodge conscription, there's also a few options available. Being medically unfit is the most common. However, those who are called upon can also apply for alternative civil service, which is a longer stint in public service jobs, such as weapons manufacturing, nursing, cleaning, or working in the postal service. The only problem is that conscripts working in these positions are often perceived as draft dodgers anyway. Another way to get out of service is to preemptively leave Russia entirely, often to countries like neighboring Georgia or Kazakhstan. Lastly, conscripts can turn to the help of specialist lawyers who can help men get out of conscription. Oftentimes when the military registration office needs to go through a lawyer to conscript a person for service, the threat of getting tangled up in legal bullshit can make them more trouble than they're worth, leaving the recruiters to simply enroll some other poor bastard. According to a coalition of lawyers who help young Russians avoid conscription, calls to their hotline are currently 10 times higher than usual since Russia invaded Ukraine. In a tactical sense, it's less favorable to use conscripted soldiers to fight in Ukraine, as they're far less experienced, tend to surrender more willingly, and less likely to believe Russian state propaganda. As the war has continued, foreign fighters have also made headlines for their involvement in the war, which has made the conflict even more complicated. At around the middle of June, a Kremlin spokesperson declared that the Geneva Convention would not apply to a pair of American soldiers who were captured while fighting for Ukraine, and in this situation alone, there's a lot to unpack. For most citizens around the world, fighting within Ukraine is entirely legal, provided that their nation is diplomatically aligned with the country. Secondly, to be protected by the Geneva Convention, soldiers need to be fighting within Ukraine's official foreign legion, meaning soldiers would need to sign up for several years to be eligible. In many cases, foreign fighters have gone through official channels, which has granted them this protection, but many others who haven't been so enthusiastic about signing up for years at a time have simply crossed into Ukraine and started fighting on their own terms. In the case of the two captured American soldiers, the Kremlin have branded them soldiers of fortune, meaning they are not protected by the Geneva Convention, but in practice, this is very unlikely. Ukraine's Foreign Legion only pays as little as $230 a month. However, a professional mercenary can make up to 200 times this amount in a relatively much safer area of the world, which really makes the soldier of fortune branding sound like a fucking stretch. Ultimately, however, Russia has treated the international law as a Geneva suggestion ever since the war began, and with ample evidence of the use of cluster bombs, sexually assaulting citizens, torture, and straight up massacring entire communities, Russia will just brand people however they see fit to justify their actions against them. In another international incident this month, it was reported that US citizen and two-time basketball Olympic gold medalist Brittney Griner has been sentenced to 9 years in a Russian penal colony. Mrs. Griner was officially charged with international drug smuggling, but in more simple terms, she was caught with less than a gram of hash oil that was prescribed by her doctor. Brittney Griner rose to prominence as a 6'9" force of nature within women's basketball, and after initially making around $60,000 a year, she decided to play internationally for a taste of the good life. By playing overseas in her off-season, she could make as much as $600,000 within China and up to $1 million within Russia, which according to our very own Jake the Analyst, is a lot more than $60,000 a year. However, on the 17th of February this year, only a week before Russia launched its invasion into Ukraine, Brittney Griner was caught at a customs checkpoint, taken to a holding cell, before being told she was guilty of international drug smuggling. It's important to note that prosecutors within Russia have a 99% conviction rate, which means in practice, to be accused of a crime is to be convicted of a crime. This is the same country that in 2017 overwhelmingly voted to effectively decriminalize domestic violence, so the nation isn't exactly known to be the gold standard of justice. The Biden administration, obviously not thrilled at having a two-time Olympic gold medalist sentenced to 9 years in prison, subsequently offered a trade for her freedom, and to call it generous would be a fucking understatement. In exchange for a woman who was caught with less than a gram of medically prescribed hash oil, the US government would offer none other than Viktor Bout, a Russian international arms dealer, responsible for indirectly killing potentially hundreds of thousands of people throughout Africa in the early to mid-90s. Viktor Bout was famously portrayed by Nicolas Cage in the film Lord of War, which if we are only reporting objective truth, is Nicolas Cage's best film. In an absolutely insane turn of events, Russia would refuse the offer after the Biden administration would not agree to throw an unnamed assassin into the deal. Many have quite reasonably come to the conclusion that Brittney Griner has become a political pawn in a game she never wanted to play, and it seems as if her wife will have to hope that the US government can find enough merchants of death to trade before conditions within her penal colony deteriorate. It has now been over 7 months since Russia began its invasion into Ukraine, and due to a combination of stiff Ukrainian resistance, Russian incompetence, and a significant level of foreign aid, Ukraine still appears to be standing strong. When the invasion started, many observers had estimated that Russia would establish air superiority within a single day, take the capital of Kiev in half a week, and perhaps even force a surrender before the end of February. As it currently stands, air superiority has not been established. Russian forces have all but given up on all efforts to take the capital, and this month marks what many would consider a turning point for the war. On the 6th of September, after a long planning period, Ukrainian forces would launch a surprise counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region, and would go on to retake a staggering 6,000 square kilometers over the next week. How Ukrainian forces managed to pull this off was down to a number of critical factors. One of the most important was its disinformation strategy leading up to the counter-offensive. With winter on the horizon, and knowing that victory pivoted heavily on international support, the higher-ups in the Ukrainian government knew that they needed a significant public victory. This was especially true for the rest of Europe, as the colder it becomes, the more that Russia could leverage the control of its gas supply to shift sentiment against the war. Ukraine had already been scoring plenty of wins on the information front, but to the casual observer, nothing wins support and boosts morale quite like a battlefield victory. Initially, the plan was to retake the southern port cities of Kherson and Mariupol, as these would give Ukraine a stronger foothold in the Black Sea. However, like a level-gated RPG, Russian forces tended to become harder to displace the further south in the country you went, but by using the same comparison, with the help of its allies, Ukraine only seemed to become comparatively stronger the longer the war continued. $14.5 billion worth of military aid from the United States alone tends to make resistance a whole lot easier. The general plan leading up to the counter-offensive was to convince Russian intelligence that they were preparing to retake the south, forcing them to divert resources away from the east of the country, which was the real target of the attack. The attack itself seemed to mirror the tactics employed by the United States during the invasion of Iraq, which saw heavy weapons and armored vehicles blitz into enemy territory with the intention of catching defenders by surprise. According to the locals of some of the retaken villages, some Russian soldiers were reported to have fled on bicycles, disguised in civilian clothing, after realizing they were about to be overrun. In the aftermath of the counter-offensive, Ukrainian representatives certainly didn't waste the opportunity to talk shit about their invaders, with Special Forces press officer Taras Berezovets calling the assault, quote, a big special disinformation operation. The label appears to be a cheeky reference to Vladimir Putin's insistence that the invasion be called, quote, a special military operation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would also comment on the victory, saying, quote, the Russian army these days is demonstrating its best ability to show its back. Within Russia, the counter-offensive has served as an obvious defeat, even if the Ministry of Defense has framed the attack as a pre-planned decision to regroup and redeploy. Russian media personalities, usually siding with the Kremlin, have blamed Russian military leaders for not doing enough to remedy their shortcomings, and countries who previously seemed to be unofficially aligned with Russia, such as China and India, have appeared to distance themselves from Mr. Putin. With such a victory 6 months after the invasion, not only does this send a message to those within Russia, but also to Ukrainian allies who have supported the country since the start of the war. To Ukraine, this was proof that if they are able to stay supplied and supported by their allies, then not only can they hold back Russia from taking the country, but they actually have a fighting chance to eventually win the war altogether. Whether this happens is difficult to say, as the longer the war continues, the more likely it is for public support from key contributing nations to decline. Europe will start seeing higher electricity prices once the continent grows colder over winter. Inflation and political division within the United States could lead to an uncertain level of public support, and many citizens may begin to question whether their tax dollars should be used to fund another foreign war. In general, however, such support appears to be dwarfed by the effects felt within Russia. Oil and gas imports have been largely sanctioned by NATO allies, which has historically made up 39% of Russia's national budget, and import bans will make it difficult for Russia to manufacture weapons and other critical supplies. Experts predict that Russia won't feel the real effects of these sanctions until at least early next year, meaning in this war of attrition, it will likely come down to how long Ukrainian allies are willing to keep Ukraine armed and dangerous. In any case, it's currently estimated that Russia's economy won't be able to return to pre-invasion levels for at least another 7 years, and it won't be able to return to full strength militarily for an entire generation. To some more light-hearted news, we now move on to the war in Ukraine, which we'll start with a fun mystery. On the 8th of October, an explosion occurred on the roadway of the Crimean Bridge, causing parts of the structure to collapse. The bridge, opened in 2018 by Vladimir Putin himself, is the longest in Europe, spanning 19 kilometers and costing the equivalent of $3.7 billion, enough to run the US military for nearly 2 whole days. However, the significance of the bridge goes beyond big numbers, as it was initially built after Russia annexed the Ukrainian region of Crimea in 2014, in an attempt to connect mainland Russia to this newly invaded territory. In terms of who caused the explosion, your guess is as good as ours. The most obvious culprit is Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian foreign minister rejected these claims, stating that the bridge is too heavily protected for their forces to attack. Another explanation was that the attack was an inside job from Russia to stir up more internal support for the war, which might explain why half the bridge is still operational. With this in mind, experts say that it's unlikely that Russia would damage its own critical infrastructure, especially when it's losing ground in the war. Other explanations could include Ukrainian black ops groups, or even Russian citizens sympathetic to Ukraine within the war. It's also possible that Ukraine simply didn't want to take credit for the explosion, as civilian casualties would be damaging for its support on the world stage. As of time of writing, we are still left to speculate. Speaking of foreign support, the Biden administration would send an additional $725 million in additional security assistance to Ukraine, putting the all-time figure at $18 billion. since January this year. The latest round of assistance includes smaller arms and ammunition, but most notably, High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or HIMARS. These weapons systems have been some of the most defining of the conflict and have allowed Ukrainian forces to rapidly fire precision rockets hundreds of kilometers behind Russian front lines. Western allies were initially concerned at even giving Ukraine access to HIMARS in the first place, arguing that they could be used to destroy targets within Russia itself. However, there have been no instances of this happening so far. Foreign support has so far been vital for Ukraine in its war against Russia, which has both crippled Russia with increasingly tight economic sanctions, as well as providing Ukraine the equipment needed to continue fighting. Within the United States, support for the war is still mostly positive, with a Gallup poll conducted in August showing that 66% of US adults were in support of Ukraine reclaiming territory, even if it prolonged the conflict, while 31% were in favor of ending the conflict quickly, even if it meant allowing Russia to keep territory from the peace deal. Those favoring a fast resolution to the war argue that it would ultimately stop more bloodshed from occurring, and that the United States shouldn't be spending billions of dollars on even more conflicts on the other side of the world. Those in support of Ukraine reclaiming territory have argued that Russia is the clear aggressor, and that if gone unchecked, it would invite more of these kinds of expansionist campaigns. There's also the argument that the United States is one of the biggest winners of the war in Ukraine, as not only do they get to significantly strengthen their reputation on the world stage, but they can also bring back their Savior of Europe badge that they haven't been able to wear for the past 80 years. Not only this, but with a comparatively minuscule amount of money, they've been able to essentially cripple one of their biggest rivals both economically and militarily, and do so without losing a single US soldier in combat. Cold War era presidents would be frothing at the mouth to be able to beat Russia this cheaply, as this is effectively the equivalent of holding a midget at arm's length. This month also saw the introduction of a new weapon into the conflict, as Russia employed kamikaze drones to the front line. These kamikaze drones are known to be particularly difficult to counter, as they are capable of loitering in a predetermined location for extended periods before crashing its 50-kilogram explosive payload into an enemy target. The drones themselves appear to be a way to get around sanctions of components used in more traditional munitions, as Western intelligence almost immediately identified them as being made by Iran. US allies have voiced condemnation for Iran supplying such weapons, not only because they are supporting an expansionist war, but because by supplying these drones, Iran is in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Without getting into too much detail, the resolution was basically an agreement for Iran to stop trying to make nuclear weapons in exchange for Western allies to stop crippling their entire economy with sanctions. Part of this deal was to bar Iran from transferring or selling certain military technology, which is exactly why the United States has called the transfer illegal. With this in mind, Russia is currently in the process of invading a neighboring country, and Iran's security forces killed over 200 protesters in the most recent wave of anti-government demonstrations. As both of these nations are currently being piper-parried with sanctions anyway, it stands to reason that neither really have much to lose from this transaction. With winter in Ukraine fast approaching, and with no end in sight, it's likely that the war will slow down over the colder months, before eventually intensifying when the weather becomes more conducive to combat. In any case, we expect to be covering this conflict long into the future. We now move on to the biggest shit show since the Star Wars sequel trilogy, as it's now been 9 months since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Starting us off on the 2nd of November, the Black Sea grain deal resumed operation after a 5-day blockade was put in place by the Russian military. To quickly summarize, the opening months of the war saw the Russian Navy blockade trade routes along the Black Sea, halting exports of grain to other nations. Ukraine itself is one of the world's biggest exporters of these sources of food, so following pressure by frequent importers, such as Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia, Russia agreed to suspend its blockade, provided these lanes aren't used for military purposes. The aforementioned suspension of this agreement was triggered when Russia accused Ukraine of using these shipping lanes as a launch site for attack drones aimed at Crimea's Sevastopol seaport. Fortunately, the blockade was lifted following signed assurances from Ukraine, and the deal was even extended for another 120 days. With the global economy still facing challenges from COVID-19, the Black Sea grain deal could quite literally be saving hundreds of thousands of lives. In terms of the actual fighting, Ukrainian forces claimed a major victory this month when they were finally able to retake the city of Kherson, the only regional capital fully held and controlled by Russian troops since the start of the war. On the 11th of November, Russian forces, sensing they could no longer hold on to the region, would swiftly retreat from the city, allowing Ukraine to retake the territory virtually unchallenged. Citizens of the city were seen celebrating following its liberation, while President Volodymyr Zelensky would declare the day a major victory in the war and a serious turning point for Ukraine. Kherson itself commands a strong position on Ukraine's eastern border, and its control alone heavily discourages further advances into the western regions of Mykolaiv and Odessa. Ukrainian military analyst Ales Dano would speculate that Russia would be heavily invested in retaking the city by any means necessary, as its control allows Ukrainian forces to target key supply routes all over the southern region of the country. The south of Ukraine has long been a stronghold for Russia since the start of the invasion, and the capture of such a key city is excellent news for anyone invested in a Ukrainian victory. With this in mind, the human cost for this war has only been climbing, with the United States estimating a death toll of around 100,000 per side in the conflict, as well as around 40,000 Ukrainian civilians, and around 30 million who have been forced to flee their homes. Despite these estimations, Russia's official death toll for its quote, special military operation is only around 6,000, which leads experts within the SWAG news team to question whether this Vladimir Putin guy is a source to be trusted. Even with a significant Ukrainian victory in the south, it was far from good news for those still living within Ukraine. In a continued effort to destabilize Ukraine's power grid, along with other critical infrastructure, Russia has been shelling the absolute shit out of the country from across the border. This practice was especially brought to international attention when on the 15th of November, a missile landed within the borders of Poland, subsequently killing 2 civilians. Not only was this an unnecessary loss of life, but it also sparked something of an international incident, as it could be interpreted as Poland being attacked. Since Poland is part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, it also gets all the perks and benefits of aligning with the group, and these include some pretty significant bonuses. Specifically, Article 5 of NATO's treaty has a very explicit rule toward collective defense, meaning any attack on one NATO ally is to be considered a direct attack on all allies within the treaty. However, before Russia was forced to face a gauntlet of 30 very angry foreign militaries, it would be discovered that the missile which landed in Poland was actually a Ukrainian air defense missile, which misfired in an attempt to defend from Russian attacks. Although the situation would eventually cool off following this investigation, it left nations bordering Ukraine even more concerned with their future security. As of time of writing, the Kiel Institute has tracked an estimated 96 billion in Ukrainian aid from 40 separate countries to date, around half of which is humanitarian and financial aid, and around 50% of the total is from the United States. As of the middle of this month, the White House made another request of 38 billion in aid to the nation, enough to fund the entire US military for just over 17 days. As always, a link to all sources used will be in the description. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is now stretching into its 10th consecutive month, and despite the winter months slowing down the pace of combat, life on the front line is still as harsh as ever. It wouldn't be a month of news without another round of sanctions on Russia, with the G7, Australia, and the European Union all capping the price of Russian oil at $60 a barrel. This means that it would be illegal to purchase Russian oil at a lower price, which is designed to limit Russia's oil revenue while minimizing the damage done to nations who rely on Russian exported oil. Critics of this policy argue that this price is still far too high if the goal is to cripple Russia's economy. As for within Russia, Vladimir Putin would publish a video to his Human Rights Council, stating that the nation's special military operation could last a very long time. When asked whether he would be deploying Russia's roughly 300,000 reserve troops, he would respond that such action would not be necessary, considering that Russia's poor logistics have made it difficult to supply troops currently deployed. This statement is far less surprising than the fact that he has a fucking Human Rights Council in the first place. The announcement comes just a week before the discovery of child torture chambers in the now liberated Ukrainian city of Kherson. Vladimir Putin would also further hint at the use of nuclear weapons, stating that Russia would do anything in its power to defend itself, likely as a threat to deter more foreign support for Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, it appears that the defending team have made some new and exciting breakthroughs for how to compel Russian soldiers to surrender. A wide-ranging effort called I Want to Live sees Ukraine provide instructions to Russian troops for how to surrender to drones flying overhead. The program includes a website, a hotline for soldiers to express their intention to surrender, as well as instructions for how to surrender peacefully. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense claims that the program has received 1.2 million inquiries since it was created in the middle of September, and that Ukraine has received over 4,300 direct requests to surrender. For Ukraine, the cost of humanely detaining and caring for captured soldiers is far exceeded by the value of having a constant stream of first-hand information directly from the Russian front lines, and it's hoped that if Ukraine can build a reputation for taking care of its prisoners, more Russian soldiers will be compelled to surrender. While Ukraine has the advantage of being unified under the defense of the nation, Russia appears to have no such luxury, and this has led to instances of infighting among those deployed to the front. Most notably this month was the case of a Russian tank commander intentionally destroying a Russian checkpoint, one of only many such instances of friendly fire since the start of the war. Only last month, 14 Russian troops were killed after being hit by their own artillery, and one Russian commander estimated that as much as 60% of their casualties have been from friendly fire. Experts suspect that this number is likely very over-exaggerated, but stated that a commander admitting this publicly likely means that it's become a pretty big problem. This is made more complicated with the inclusion of both Chechen forces and Russian mercenaries, who are not part of the traditional chain of command, and who very often don't tend to work well together. On the 21st of December, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would leave the country for the first time since the start of the invasion and head to the United States. In a visit to Congress, Zelensky would give a 23-minute speech to a particularly warm reception, and the comedian turned wartime leader would even get a few laughs despite the circumstances. Ultimately, the visit to the most generous supporter of Ukraine's war effort seemed to have worked, as on the very next day, the United States would draft a $1.7 trillion spending bill, which would pledge another $45 billion in continued aid to Ukraine. In something of a coincidence, on the very same day, Vladimir Putin would refer to the invasion as a war for the very first time, although it's not clear whether this was an intentional classification or if it was simply a Freudian slip. As it currently stands, neither side appears to be close to conceding to the other, and although the coming months may be less active as the temperatures become more unforgiving, it's hard to see an end to the conflict anytime in the near future. Against the backdrop of the war, early this month saw the governments of the United States and Russia agree on a prisoner transfer. Russia would trade gold medal basketball player Brittney Griner for international arms dealer Viktor Bout. Brittney Griner was arrested in Russia less than a week before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and was subsequently arrested for the possession of less than a gram of cannabis oil in her luggage. Although prescribed by her doctor, the Russian court would sentence Ms. Griner to 9 years in prison and ordered to pay the equivalent of around $16,000. Viktor Bout, on the other hand, often called the Merchant of Death by news outlets, is a Russian arms dealer who operated heavily in the 1990s and 2000s, but was previously in the Soviet armed forces leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union. Mr. Bout would eventually be arrested by US drug enforcement agents in 2008 after they pretended to be members of a Colombian rebel group trying to buy anti-aircraft missiles. He would then be sentenced to 25 years in prison, much to the condemnation of the Russian government, for which it's believed that Bout was an important asset to the nation's intelligence agencies. The ethics of such a transfer is complicated to say the least, and whether the freedom of an innocent woman is worth the release of an international arms dealer is a debate for the comment section, but the unfortunate truth is that there are still more Americans detained within Russia that have yet to be released. Former US Marine Paul Whelan is currently serving 16 years for accusations of spying, while schoolteacher Mark Fogel was sentenced to 14 years in August last year for the possession of half an ounce of medical marijuana. The US government have declined to confirm whether or not more American citizens are being detained, but it's hoped that the high-profile case of Brittany Griner can bring more attention to other cases of bullshit detentions.
What if it's me looking down on me? The world above must also be. This could go on for infinity.